Nobody would say that a Catalan is not a Spanish citizen or that a Tibetan is not a Chinese citizen. In Israel, the case is different because this is a military occupation. Israel never annexed the West Bank. So Palestinians are not Israeli citizens against their will. They are not Israeli citizens at all. They are actually citizens of no country in the world.
Really?
And that has been going for since 1967. So that's the root of the problem right now.
All right, Young and Naive, we're still in beautiful Tel Aviv, and who are you?
Noam Sheifaz, I'm a journalist. I write for a site called 972 magazine and on various publications in Hebrew.
And where are we here?
We are in Rabin Square at the center of Tel Aviv. Behind us is the City Hall, Tel Aviv City Hall. And this is like the central square for protests and national events.
Do people protest here regularly?
Well, they do. There was a large protest, considerably large, against the war. There were like 5,000 to 10,000 people 10 days ago. And protests here can take like dozens of thousands as well if there are like national events.
So you mentioned protests. Noam, tell us what is going on in Israel these days?
Well, as you can see, in some parts things are pretty normal. Though we do have occasionally sirens in Tel Aviv. The Iron Dome anti-missile system intercepts most of the rockets, and life are pretty much at normal right now. In the south, there is an ongoing military campaign. Some are calling it a war by now. This is where there are way more rockets. If you drive an hour south from here, you'll see things are very different. You'll see a lot of military forces, and you'll hear way more sirens. And in Gaza, there's the military campaign itself.
What's going on in Gaza?
Well, in the past month or so, Israel engages in a military campaign against Hamas, which is the regime in Gaza. The first 3 weeks involved airstrikes, first 2.5 weeks, and then in the last 10 days there was a ground offensive, and now the forces are pulling back to the Israeli side of the border. The ground offensive is ended, pretty much. That's what I read in the news. And the forces are on the way back to the Israeli side of the border. There have been many casualties in this escalation, some 1,700 Palestinians and over 60 Israelis. Most of the Palestinians are civilians, and most of the Israelis are soldiers.
Well, just going to mention today's Sunday, August 3rd, so I mean, it doesn't seem to be over yet. So
No,
numbers could change.
No, I think we're entering a new stage today. I think Israel wants to go back to the way things were during the first 3 weeks, when it didn't involve ground activities in the Gaza Strip, but mostly strikes from the air or from the sea.
Why do they fight each other?
That's a good question. I think that there are many layers here. There is the history of the conflict. There is the current history of the conflict of the last few years. And there are the particular circumstances that led to this escalation. So I wonder which of these you're interested in.
Well, what do you think is the most important aspect of why are these two sides that are fighting, or are there more sides to the fight?
Well, there are many what you call like participants or actors taking place, but only two sides are fighting. Israel and the Hamas, mostly the Hamas militants, which is a small terror or guerrilla organization, several thousand active combatants from what I hear. Israel has a very strong and powerful army, one of the strongest in the world, one of the biggest in the region, but only part of it is occupied in the fighting itself. If you go back to the circumstances, I think that for Hamas, the object of the war is to lift the siege on Gaza. Gaza has been under siege for more than 7 years. Israel controls all the exit and the entrances to the Gaza and doesn't allow goods inside or outside except for things that Israel wants to allow,
Really?
mostly food.
Why? Why do they? Is it like a prison?
Well, from my perspective, Gaza is indeed like a prison, like an open-air prison for 2 million people, and I think that Hamas want to challenge this siege. From the Israeli perspective, it's about restoring peace and order, because the way Hamas challenges the siege is through throwing rockets. Israel doesn't accept that. So he wants basically the Palestinians to accept things as they are from now. And it is willing to reconsider the policy of the siege if Hamas gives up power in Gaza. Since political entities don't abandon power on their own goodwill, so here we are.
Is every Palestinian Hamas fighter or not?
That 1.8 million Palestinians in Gaza, and from what I hear, between some thousands and maybe 20,000 are actively part of the Hamas militant arm.
So a tiny fraction.
A tiny fraction, yeah. Well, not every Israeli is a soldier as well, you know. It's usual in such conflicts that only a part of the population is actively taking part in the fighting, but everybody can get hurt, especially in Gaza.
So why do, I mean, you say Hamas, there are only a few thousand fighters. I mean, they're not an army. They're like, you say, like a guerrilla group, like a terror group.
Yeah.
Why do they even try to fight an army, an Israeli army? Why isn't that stupid? I mean, don't they know that they could?
I would use the word desperate rather than stupid. Of course, that Israel is way more powerful than the Palestinians. So it's all in all the armed conflicts that have been in recent years. The Palestinians suffered enormous casualties, while Israel didn't suffer casualties at all, or it suffered minor casualties. Not to trivialize every person that dies, but there is a difference between losing 10 or 20 or 50 soldiers to losing 1,700 like it is in Gaza now, which is 0.1% of the population there. These are enormous numbers. So I think that Hamas understands that. I think that the Palestinians understand that. I think that Hamas feels that it was pushed to a corner and has no other choice. Also, this is an organization that chose the military way to fight the occupation as opposed to the Palestinian Authority that is seeking a diplomatic resolution. So it does what it knows to do.
Why is Gaza occupied?
Most Israelis would answer that Gaza is not occupied, but Gaza, I think, is occupied by Israel. If you study political science, or if you look at how countries behave, there are certain thresholds for a state to be considered sovereign. For example, you need to control your own borders or to give them up willingly, like you did in the European Union. You need to control your own currency. You need to control who is a citizen and who is not. Your airspace. These are what people usually consider independence or sovereignty. So
does that work for Gaza?
Yeah. So in Gaza and even in the West Bank, it's the same case everywhere. Israel controls the airspace. Israel controls the borders. Israel, except for one border to Egypt, which is also sealed for Egypt. The Egyptians have their own reasons for it. Israel control the currency. They use the same currency there. Israel even control registering who is allowed to be called a Palestinian resident or not. So even if you can say that there are no Israeli forces inside Gaza, I think you cannot call neither Gaza nor the West Bank independence, and that's what the Palestinians are saying.
Is Hamas the government of the Gazans?
Yeah, Hamas is the government. Hamas Hamas is currently the government of Gaza. There's a history to this. In 2006, I think, there were national elections in the Palestinian Authority. Hamas won these elections.
A guerrilla group won an election.
Hamas is also like many other guerrilla organizations. It belongs to a political party. If you think about Sinn Féin and the IRA in Northern Ireland, or almost any other anti-colonial battle, the main underground has a militant wing and a political wing. So the political wing won the elections in 2006. But Israel boycotted the government that ensued because it doesn't recognize Hamas as a legitimate partner for a political dialogue because it is a militant wing.
They boycotted it after the results of the election,
after
or
the result of the Israel wouldn't cooperate with the Hamas-led government.
Why not?
Because Hamas is a militant organization. Israel demands as a precondition to talk into the organization that the organization disarm itself and abandon the militant battle. So, and Hamas wouldn't do it. And
Has Israel ever talked to or negotiated with a militant fraction of the
the PLO before it, but the PLO recognized Israel. The PLO, the Fatah, the other important political party in the Palestinian people, Israel has been negotiating with it since the early 90s. At the beginning, it was still considered in Israel a terror organization, but once the serious negotiation began, they changed the law here. And they started regarding it as a political representative. Even when Fatah went back to a military way, to military struggle in the Second Intifada, then Israel continued to having some sort of ties with it.
What's an intifada?
Intifada is the Palestinian name for popular uprising. There have been two intifadas in 1987 to the early 90s. That's the first one, which is mostly a civil population revolt, and the second intifada, which was an armed struggle, was in the years 2000 till 2004, something like that.
Why did they rise up?
Well, I think it goes back to what I said, like there are many layers to the conflict. There are problems of Palestinians who were displaced during the Israel's War of Independence in 48. There is a problem of Jerusalem. But the most burning issue for Palestinians is Gaza and the West Bank, where the population is, as you put it, and I agree, like in an open-air prison. In Gaza and in the West Bank, Palestinians are not part of the sovereign regime. They cannot vote in elections. They can only vote to a Palestinian Authority, which has very little power. They cannot travel freely, also in the West Bank, not just in Gaza. They need permits for Israel to travel. They cannot establish their own even corporations. If you want to start a business activity, you can't do it without Israeli authorization. I'll give you just one example. If you go to the West Bank, Palestinians don't have a network with G3, with internet on their smartphones, because Israel does not allow it to Palestinian providers.
Why?
It keeps the frequencies for itself, and it says that in a final settlement it might allow more freedoms to the Palestinians. But currently, since Israel is the sovereign, every activity which is beyond like opening a grocery shop in the street or doing something which require a national infrastructure is totally dependent on Israel, and there's not a lot of goodwill in the Israeli side. So Palestinians feel like prisoners of Israel especially since 1967, when the territories were occupied.
So I mean, every occupation. I mean, look at world history. Every occupation has to end at some point. How did?
Yeah, but it doesn't say at what point.
Okay, but let's maybe look at other occupations. How did they end? Like, where are solutions to? How do occupations end? Like, are there different ways?
Yeah, it depends. You know, not every group of people that considers itself a nation is independent. You take the Kurds. Some people in parts of Spain will tell you that they're not independent, that they are forced into being Spaniard citizens, but they are all citizens, and that's the big difference. Even if you take the worst cases like Tibet, or some Indonesian island which wants independence, until they receive independence, if they ever, they are considered citizens, at least formally, of the annexing state. Like nobody would say that a Catalan is not a Spanish citizen or that a Tibetan is not a Chinese citizen. In Israel, the case is different because this is a military occupation. Israel never annexed the West Bank. So Palestinians are not Israeli citizens against their will. They are not Israeli citizens at all. They are actually citizens of no country in the world.
Really?
And that has been going for since 1967. So that's the root of the problem right now.
So how did other occupations in world history end?
Well, some of them didn't end. The Kurdish problem still exists, and the problem of Cyprus, Turkish Cyprus, still exists. But most of them, you would have either one of two solutions. Either the occupied nation accepts its place within the occupying power. You would say, let's say, the Catalan, until further notice, they are part of Spain and they're not taking up arms against that.
So that would mean Gaza and West Bank
being annexed to Israel and the Palestinians become citizens. This is what people normally refer to as the one-state solution, a single unified state where everyone are the citizens. Or you would have a separation in which the occupied people get their own state in part of the land or in the entirety of it, as happened in like many places, Kosovo or I don't know. There are numerous examples.
So that would mean there would be two Palestinian states because Gaza and West Bank, they're not connected.
Well, when the idea of a Palestinian state was discussed seriously, then there were all sorts of arrangement declared on to connect the two regions, like a safe passage, and there have been ideas like that in the world. You can think of the way Berlin was connected to West Germany, and since this was meant to be a peaceful reconciliation, it's not even the tension of East and West Berlin. It means that simply getting a highway and a system of safe passage, and so people consider Gaza and the West Bank to be one territorial unit. They're the same people. Sometimes you see families from Gaza and the West Bank separated.
And Palestinians in Israel are the same people?
Yes, of course they are. The War of 48 created the... in the War of 48, many Palestinians were displaced, meaning that some of them abandoned the state on their own will as refugees, and some of them were deported. But all of them weren't allowed back by Israel. And these people settled in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in other countries, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon. So there are Palestinians not just all over what you call Israel or Palestine, but all across the region. There are Palestinians in Iraq, there are Palestinians in Kuwait. Some of them are considered refugees by the UN and by the international community. Some of them are refugees but under Israeli occupation in Gaza and in the West Bank. And some of them are in Israel proper. About 1 million of them are Israeli citizens within Israel proper, not in the West Bank and not in Gaza. There are some 1 million Palestinians who are citizens.
So maybe let's talk about the war right now. Do you consider it a war between two sides, or is there only a war like in Gaza? What do you think?
The war is one-sided in the sense that it takes place in Gaza and it has repercussions all over, like the fact that there are missile rockets directed at Tel Aviv and other cities means that the war does affect the entire country, unlike previous escalations where shooting was limited to the south. But
do rockets hit Tel Aviv?
Well, there's a protective anti-missile system called the Iron Dome, which is very successful at preventing those. So there hasn't been any casualties in Tel Aviv.
Do Gaza do they have an Iron Dome?
Gaza doesn't have any sort of defensive mechanism against Israel assault, which accounts for the high number of casualties, civilian casualties. Again, we're talking over there, for better or for worse, a guerrilla or terror organization which is in a heavily dense area. So basically the guerrilla fighters are between citizens, residents in Gaza, and they try to fight to find any sort of solution that they can.
So is it like I guess since it's a war, there are people killed. Are only soldiers killed or the Hamas fighters killed?
It's very difficult to tell who is a Hamas fighter and who is not. According to Israel claims that it hits a large number of Hamas fighters. The world and the international community claims that most of the Palestinians, of course, claim that most of the casualties are civilian. There are hundreds of children who were killed, who are obviously not Hamas fighters. I think my impression from reading the reports, reading Palestinian sources, is that most of the casualties in the Palestinian side are civilians.
How can that be?
As I said, they're fighting. It's a heavily dense population.
But if Israel, the army knows that, why do they shoot?
The Israeli claim is that the Hamas fighters hide between civilian targets, that they shoot from schools, that they shoot next to hospitals. That's what the Israelis would tell you.
But like if like I mean, even Germany, when there's like a police, like a SWAT team, and they know that the guy has like taken some prisoners or something, and they know they can't shoot the bad guy. They have to decide not to shoot at all.
This is where it gets this bizarre situation with the Palestinians, because while the Palestinians are not independent, and some would say that they're even occupied by Israel, Israel does not treat them as its own citizens, but its enemy citizens.
Oh.
So just like there's a difference between the police in Germany or in Denmark to, let's say, the conduct of the Danish or American or any military force in Afghanistan. So Israel is an occupying force in the West Bank in Gaza, and it treats the population like the American would treat a population in Iraq or in Afghanistan. The problem is that this is not. The problem is that people are getting killed, of course, but what's different about Afghanistan and Iraq, this is something that's been going on for 47 years. And it's not a one-time incident when the army went on a war, conquered the territory, and now needs to find ways to finish the mission and evacuate. Israel is present there for half a century while treating the people that it's responsible for as its enemies.
So how will this war in Gaza end?
Well, if I would have known either how to end the occupation or how this current escalation would end, I don't know, I would have made a fortune of it, and not just talk to you. But
it's I learned when there is a war, both sides or between sides, there's always goals. Like a war is something to achieve a goal.
For Hamas, the goal is to end the siege, to become a proper sovereign in the Gaza Strip. They want to control the airspace. They want to be able to have boats come from outside, and they want to export their own goods. They cannot export, and they can only buy food from Israel, so it's a captive market. So Hamas wants to end the siege. That's at least what they're saying. Israel wants to keep things as they were, It's not clear what the Israeli end goal is. So some say that Gaza should be demilitarized. Others say that
Demilitarized means what?
meaning that Hamas needs to abandon its weapons. Others say no, we cannot force that without conquering the entire strip. So let's just force them to accept a ceasefire, which I think Israeli would settle too. They would say, we will not lift the siege, and Hamas needs to accept that for the time being. This will be a successful outcome for Israel.
But that wouldn't like essentially wouldn't change anything.
No, it wouldn't. Israel wants to go back to the way things were.
But I mean that doesn't change anything, or that doesn't seem to be a solution.
I don't think this government is interested in pursuing a solution. I think this government is about maintaining a current status quo in the West Bank and in Gaza.
Really?
Yes, because there were many options to find the solutions. There were peace talks last year, and the government didn't seem thrilled about them.
Really? They don't want peace.
I wouldn't say they don't want peace. Every person wants peace. I think they want peace even now. They're just not willing to take the necessary concession and the risks involved to maintain it, because there are great risks involved in pursuing a compromise. It could be that if you evacuate the territory, then other forces will take control of it and start shooting at you back. It could be that you'll have a huge internal political battle in Israel. We're sitting in Rabin Square. It we used to call the Kikar Malchei Israel. The name is a reference to the Bible, the old name. But after the Prime Minister Rabin was shot in this square and killed 4 going into a peace process, they changed the name of the square. So this demonstrates the toxic atmosphere regarding this issue inside the Israeli society. So both in terms of the external risk, the security risk, both in terms of the political risk inside, the government may conclude that the status quo represents the best course of action right now. And to finish this up, most occupying countries do not give their territories on their own just because they woke up one day and said, oh, this is not right.
So I mean, we're a European show, or many people watch us even in America. What could the West, or what do you think should the West or the rest of the world do to like help solve this conflict, this war, this ongoing, seemingly never-ending conflict?
I think that the West should do one thing and should avoid the other. The one thing it should do is make it clear to Israel that it needs to end the occupation. By making it clear, I mean condition all the benefits that Israel gets as a Western country in the fact that it needs to end the occupation. So you want a piece of those trade agreements. You want to be considered a Western democracy. You want to, I don't know, take part in European Championship in football. I don't know. I don't want to give ideas because the bureaucrats who writes policy knows them better. But it needs to condition the acceptance of Israel to the international community on ending the occupation. And at the same time, I don't think it needs to dictate solutions or to choose political winners and losers in the Israeli politics like they kind of do right now. I think they need to simply make up the world needs to be very firm about demanding an end to the occupation, and respectful of the solutions Israeli will find and Palestinians will find whenever that happens. But right now, what happens is the world accepts the occupation. It speaks a lot against it.
Really?
Of course, like you hear statements from the EU, from Brussels, and from your government. You'll hear a lot about the status quo is not acceptable, and the occupation should end. But in practice, in measures of policy, where things are really determined, the international community understand that some countries don't misbehave, and I guess it treats Israel this way too. As long as there's no price to misbehaviors, the misbehavior will continue.
So they say it's bad, but they don't act on it.
Of course not,
Why not?
especially in the United States. The United States actually enables this conflict to go.
Really?
When Israel ran out of ammunition for Gaza, the United States allowed Israel to use the one in its stockpiles here in Israel. So, and when a country wants to pass a UN resolution in the Security Council, so the United States or Britain or France will make sure that the resolution is not anti-Israeli in a sense. So this situation cannot exist without Western support and Western diplomatic coverage and all that. At the same time, I understand why there is empathy to the Israeli position, because Israel is really in a tough spot where, as I said, there are risks to the solution. But the international community needs to help avoiding those risks instead of just giving Israel a free pass on the current situation.
What would be like if you should be supposed to be naive now and maybe think of what would be the ideal way out of this whole crisis? You mentioned like a one-state solution. Is that your favorite way?
I don't know.
People don't seem to know.
There are many solutions. The problem is not the solution. The problem is the will. There are tons of solutions. All solutions are bad in the sense that if you start punching holes in them and looking for problems in them, you'll find many problems, every solution. But let's say you're in 1940 and people talk about the prospect of a European Union. That's absurd. And even the idea of such a solution, people say, no, we cannot open the borders because the German will infiltrate into France and the France will infiltrate into Germany, and this wouldn't work. But so all solutions have risks, all solutions have disadvantages. I'm not a big fan of either what they call the two-state solution, dividing the land, or the one-state solution in particular. I think that the country needs to make up its mind to end the occupation and then starts a political process with the Palestinians. The political process will reach, if it's fair and honest, a just solution. But we're not there yet. We're in a situation where Israelis feel that keeping things as they are is probably best for them. And look, there's a good argument in favor of what they think, because if you look around in Tel Aviv, this is maybe war, but it's very pleasant at the same time, and you don't feel at war. But if you look at, but in Gaza, it's a nightmare. So as long as Israelis feel that they can maintain things as they are, I think they will. And I think it's very tragic for Israel. And of course, I don't support any form of armed resistance to the Palestinian side, but I would like to see a strong international effort to end this in a diplomatic way.
Thank you very much, Noam.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks. Bye.